The next speaker is Max Kistler. He's Professor of Philosophy at University of Paris 1, Panthéon-Sorbonne. The title of his talk is Reply to the Exclusion Argument in Terms of Proportional and Specific Causation.
I'm allowed to take this off. Thank you very much, Jean-Baptiste and François and all the organization team, and thank you, Stephen, for being here. And everything is in the title. You'll see the topic is quite different. I pick up something from work Stephen Yablo has done in the 90s, and it's all about the so-called exclusion argument. The conclusion argument has a very striking and puzzling consequence, namely that mental events are never causes of anything. So our decisions, for example, never change anything in our behavior or in anything else in the world. In Yablo's terms, our mental lives exercise no causal influence whatever over the progress of physical events. So in particular, my decisions have no influence whatsoever on the movements of my body. So I take my quotes all from this paper Stephen Yablo has published in '92. It's called Mental Causation. This exclusion argument has as its usual conclusion that mental events are never causes of anything, but it can be generalized, and then it has the conclusion that no higher level event of all sorts, chemical, biological, economical, nothing of all that has any causal effect at all. So that's really puzzling. And so what does it mean to say it's puzzling? It's that we are more certain that this is wrong than we might be certain of any of the premises that it is derived from. So what's the premises? The closure principle, the exclusion principle, and from that it is derived that no higher level property is such that the fact that something has that higher level property at some time is causally responsible for the fact that it has a physical property at some later time. The closure principle is also called the causal closure of the physical domain, and I show it to you on this diagram. It says that if you have an event that has this physical property P2 at some time, then at every earlier time there's a physical event corresponding to a physical property such that the instantiation of this physical property is causally sufficient for the instantiation of the physical property here. So there are always complete physical causes. When you have a physical event here, for every earlier time you have a complete physical cause. So that's the first premise. And the exclusion premise says, given that you have a complete physical cause, it excludes all higher level causes. They are superfluous. So the plan is show you how I understand Yablo's solution, show you alternative solution by Karen Bennett, and then I try to make synthesis or mix of ideas in both of these solutions, and then I look at a controversial consequence of all that. So in the 1992 paper, Yablo solves the puzzle by denying one of the premises, and his strategy for denying the closure principle, which is the first premise, is that the word cause, as it occurs in the premises, should be reinterpreted, should be interpreted in a very specific way, which is proportionally caused. And if you understand the word cause everywhere in the premises as meaning proportionally caused, closure is wrong, and so we avoid the consequence that mental events are always epiphenomena or always inert. So what is proportional causation? Quote from this Yablo's paper, causes are expected to be commensurate with their effects, And the cause was the thing that made the difference between the effects occurring and it's not. So the definition I take from the paper is that X is a proportional cause of Y, if and only if. First, effects are contingent on their causes. That means if X had not occurred, then Y would not have occurred. That's basically the same thing as saying the cause must be a necessary condition for the effect. And the other condition is that the cause must be adequate for the effect. If X had not occurred, then if it had, Y would have occurred as well. And that is a way of spelling out the idea that the cause must be a sufficient condition for the effect. So one of the original examples is that it seems false in a way, and according to Yablo's thesis that cause means proportionally cause, it is false to say that Socrates guzzling the hemlock caused his death. What is true is that Socrates guzzling the hemlock was causally sufficient for his death. So guzzling is one way of drinking. And why is it false to say that guzzling the hemlock caused his death? Because caused has to be understood as proportionally cause. And proportionally cause has as one of its components that it's a necessary condition. But guzzling is not a necessary condition because you can drink in other ways. The most famous example, everyone thinking about this always uses the example of Sophie the pigeon that is trained to peck at all and only red targets or all and only red triangles. So if you have this pigeon and you show it a scarlet triangle, that will make it peck. So it is causally sufficient. Each time you show the pigeon a scarlet triangle, it will peck. So it's causally sufficient, but it's not a cause, says Stephen, because it's not proportional. And why is it not proportional? Because perceiving a scarlet triangle is not necessary. It's also sufficient to peck at other shades of red. So exactly scarlet is not necessary, and that's why it's not proportional, and that's why it's not a cause of the pigeon's pecking. So that may be, it's a solution, but why I'm not happy or other people have not been completely satisfied, because it may be too radical. So it preserves one intuition, that our decisions are causes, but it sacrifices another, maybe more fundamental intuition, and the critics might say, closure is very plausible, and saving mental causation by sacrificing closure is not better than saving closure by sacrificing mental causation. So Yablo's solution is we save mental causation, we justify that our decisions change the world, but we let go closure, we sacrifice closure. And many philosophers have said closure, that is so plausible. Everything has a physical cause. So maybe we have sacrificed too much. And I think, so this is a problem. It would be nice to be able to avoid this. It would be nice to find a solution that does not deny closure. And this is also a problem, I think, for two solutions that have been inspired by Yablo's solution. Lewis' definition of causation in terms of influence, and List and Menzies' definition of realization insensitive causation. They all share this, what I think is a shortcoming, that they deny closure. So what else can we do? We deny the other premise, and that's Karen Bennett's strategy. Instead of denying closure, deny exclusion. Exclusion says it can never happen that if you have a physical cause, you have at the same time a mental cause. And you can just deny that and say it's not plausible that a mental cause and a physical cause would be in competition if one is the supervenience base of the other. But now this strategy has the opposite weakness. I would think it lacks selectivity. We get too much causation. If you accept this, that there's no exclusion, you see that it's conceptually coherent, and very often happens, it's pervasive, that several causal influences run in parallel from the same cause event to the same fact event. So to be able to say this, I must switch terminology. I'm sorry for this. From now on, what I call an event is what fills a space-time region. So a person at a certain time is an event, and then I can say that this person at that time has different properties. And so they can, from the same event in that sense to the same another event, there can be several influences running in parallel. They don't exclude each other necessarily. But now we need some way of sorting out or picking out one that is more important or interesting than the others. So even if several causal explanations picking out these several influence relations can coexist, it seems that they are not all equally good, and maybe there's even one that is optimal, maximally good. So to take Yablo's examples to illustrate the other solution, the Bennett solution, the perception, now we can say that the perception of scarlet triangle causes, because we take cause to mean causally sufficient, and the perception of red also causes. So they are both in parallel properties that causally influence the packing. And to take another example, also from the original paper, the earthquakes being barely violent causes the collapse of the building, and at the same time, the earthquakes being violent causes the collapse of the building. So one picks out a more determinate property, having a strength between 5 and 6 for the earthquake, and the other is a more determinable property, being violent, having a strength greater than 5. So these are two properties of that earthquake, and they are both causes. Okay, so how can we select which is more important or more interesting to name in an explanation? So the solution to avoid both problems, so to get the best of both solutions, is what I'll try to show next. So the aim is to find something that can both avoid denying closure and give a way of weighing different causal influences according to their importance. And the idea is to distinguish two concepts of cause, a general sense and a more specific sense. The more general sense of cause corresponds to being a sufficient condition of the circumstances. And in this general sense of cause, closure is plausible because there's always a physical condition that is sufficient in circumstances, but exclusion is not plausible because there can be several properties that are all causally sufficient. And so both the mental and the physical in the supervenient space, they are causes of a given behavior. And then we have a more restrictive sense of cause that is specific causation, and it's derives from proportional causation. One difference is that it's not supposed to be an analysis of the ordinary meaning of the ordinary word cause. Specific causation is one type of causation. It's not supposed to be an analysis of what causation as such is. And the solution of the problem raised by Bennett's solution is that only one of these influences running in parallel is specific. So the one that is specific, it's causally responsible, and that is the best to mention in explanations. So the concept of specific causation can be made precise in the framework of structural equations. So now I show you a little bit how that works, and I take it from technical work done by Pearl and Halpern, among others. And so this is another difference between specific and proportional causation, because specific causation is defined for generic causes in terms of variables, whereas proportional causation was defined for particular events, and then we can get judgments for particular causal relations by just applying the general judgments. If you have both, if P2 is a physical event, like a physical behavior, we have in this model, we have both the physical cause and the mental cause influence the behavior, but one is specific, the mental is specific, and the physical is not specific. And if we can justify this, then we have the conclusion, which is plausible, that the mental variable is really causally influencing the physical variable. The physical also is really influencing the physical variable, but it may turn out that the mental is more explanatorily relevant than the physical variable. So it's all a variant of proportional causation, but I think what is progress with respect to the original version is that it makes mental causation conceivable even if closure is accepted. That's certainly a dialectical advantage, given that closure is taken by many physicalists as more plausible than anything else. And also an advantage, why express everything in terms of general variables instead of events. That's because the truth conditions of statements for causation and specific causation can be given in empirically observable terms. So we don't need possible worlds. We don't need to express the truth conditions in terms of possible worlds. So the structural equations model works in 3 steps. I try to give you a very simple example. We represent the system by a finite set of variables. These correspond to predicates characterizing the features of a system. And there are 2 sorts of variables, endogenous and exogenous. The endogenous variables are determined within the model, and the exogenous are not determined from within the model, they are determined from outside. If I decide to raise my arm, that's the very simplest model. I have just 2 variables, decision, D, and D equal 1 represents the fact that I take the decision to raise my arm, and D equals 0 that I don't. And the other variable, so in the set of endogenous, there's just 1, raise my arm, and the 2 values of that variable are 1, I raise my arm, and 0, I don't. And in the second step, I write structural equations that correspond to all the dependence relations that exist between the variables represented in the model. And there's exactly 1 equation for each endogenous variable. So the simplest model is that I just say the raising my arm is 100% determined only by my decision, by nothing else, and exclusively by the decision. And that can also be represented in a very simple graph where the variables occupy the nodes and the dependence relations are represented by arrows. So, of course, this model is very much oversimplified and not realistic, because, of course, you can have situations where you, I didn't want that. You can have situations where you take decision to raise your arm, but you don't, because there are all kinds of interference, and the arm may also raise for reasons independent of the decisions. You can have D0, but the arm raises. So the model is oversimplified. But we want just build a model to show that it's conceptually coherent to have mental causation and accept closure. So that's already something. And in the third step, you assign the exogenous variables a value that correspond to a particular situation. So the aim of this model building is to show that it's conceptually coherent, that decisions are causes of behavior. And so maybe it's too simple. Maybe it's an illusion, because in my model, the decision causes the behavior. So I've done it. Maybe that's too simple, because I can't even express the closure principle. I can't address the worry raised by the closure principle, because I don't represent any physical causes of the event that corresponds to R, my arm raising. So let's add one more variable. So the next most simplest model has just one variable more, which is n, that represents the physical state of the brain of the person that takes the decision. And so let's try these two values. At some moment, the person takes the decision and has one particular state of activity of her brain, and N0 is all other states of activity of the brain, and keep decision and arm raising just as before. So that would not be an adequate model because it does not respect local supervenience. So local supervenience of the psychological on the neurological corresponds to the fact that the psychological variable must be a function of the neural variable. And that means that it must be excluded that the same value of the neural variable is mapped on different values of the psychological variable. So this is, you can see the arrows. Oh, where did they go? Oh, that is very strange. So the arrows are the most important, and they have gone. Okay, so I hope we can see it. No, the arrows are gone. Okay. There is no functional dependence because for the value n equals 0, you have cases where you have a very slight departure from n equals 1, which corresponds to one very precise neural state. So if you make a slight change to that state, you might end up with a neural state that corresponds to n equals 0, but which corresponds always to the decision, because the change is very, very small. And overall, it makes no difference at the psychological level, so the person will still make a decision. So n0 can be mapped to d equal 1. But if you make a larger change, which also corresponds to n equals 0, it corresponds to not taking a decision. So here, the decision is not a function of the neural state. No arrows. So a slightly more complex model has 3 values for the neural variable, and 1 and 2 correspond to states that are in the supervenience space of decision taking. 1 is one particular state, and 2, the other is all the other underlying possible states of the decision making. And n equals 3 corresponds to not taking the decision. So then we have a functional dependence. Now we have a model in which we can look at closure and exclusion. We just keep it as before, that decision is necessary and sufficient for arm raising. And now we have 2 structural equations that correspond to 2 arrows. And one is a non-causal dependence, because the decision is a non-causal function of the function n is a function of d, but that expresses a non-causal dependence relation, and r is a function of d, and that expresses a causal dependence relation. And so now we can check whether we have closure and exclusion. We have closure in this model because r is a function of d, and d is a function of n, and functional dependence is transitive, so r is also a function of n, so we respect closure. This variable r, which corresponds to raising my arm, it's a function of a neural state, as closure postulates. And exclusion does not hold in this model because these functional dependence relations correspond to generalizations, and there's no reason why 2 such dependence relations cannot coexist. And if the model is adequate, then we have both a dependence of R on D, on the psychological variable, and a dependence of R on N, on the neurological variable. So they both coexist, and exclusion is not justified in this model. And it's not anything like genuine overdetermination. People who justify the exclusion principle, they say it's not plausible that things are always genuinely overdetermined. Things in general have only one cause, and it's very exceptional that things have many causes. And then they say, look, in the firing squad, there we have real overdetermination because the death of the victim is caused several times over. It's not like that with mental causation. It's not that we need the mind to do the things once again, once the brain has taken charge of causing the movements. But there's a crucial difference between the situation of the firing squad and the situation of mental causation. In a way, in both cases, there are several causal processes running in parallel. But in the firing squad, you have really several independent causal relations running through several mutually independent paths and caused by mutually independent particular events. Whereas in the case we are contemplating, where we have built our model for, it's this event R equal 1 is not generally overdetermined in that sense, because the two influences are not independent of each other and correspond to properties of the same person of the same time, which are dependent on each other. So you might say, okay, there's no genuine overdetermination, but in another sense, there should still be exclusion, because explaining R in terms of N is better because it explains it in terms of something more fundamental. So that's the intuition behind all these people who deny mental causation. You can do everything in terms of the most fundamental variables, which are physical. Saying that means you defend a principle of causal explanatory exclusion, according to which the best explanation is always the explanation in terms of the most fundamental. So even if you have established that there may be parallel causal relations, the best and the one that you should mention in an explanation is always the physical. So to reply to that, there's a straightforward way to showing in certain circumstances that the higher level variables are better to mention in explanations. And the criterion for the relevance of various influences, if you have several in parallel, is something that you can spell out clearly in this structural equations framework. I think that's one of the advantages why it's good to use it. These functions, they can be injective or not. And a function is injective if it never happens that two values are mapped on the same value on the other side. I hope I have arrows. Here they are. I don't know why. So it's the same arrows that I was missing before. So this is not injective because two values of the left-hand variables are mapped on the same value on the right-hand side. So this means it's not injective. And if it's injective, this never happens, and two different values are always mapped on two different values there. So the idea is that causal influence of one variable x on another variable y is specific. So that's my version of proportional causation, but for general variables. And so the definition is it's specific if and only if the function relating one to the other is an injective function, and that can be precisely defined. And then the idea is that the best explanations are the injective. If you have an explanation in terms of a variable so that the function is injective, then it's better than an explanation in terms of a variable that's not injective. And so in our model, R is a function of both N and D, but one corresponds to an injective function and the other not. And so if this is a good model, then it shows that the psychological variable not only influences the behavior, but it's also more appropriate. So we can say exactly why it's more appropriate to explain behavior in terms of decision than to explain it in terms of neural causes, because the decision corresponds to an injective function. So the difference between this condition and the original proportional cause is in a sense small, but I'll show you what's the difference. So in a sense it's small because you have both the condition of sufficient condition, which corresponds to the fact that there's a function, and the requirement that it's a necessary condition, which corresponds to my requirement that the function is injective. The difference is that in the original version, the proportional causation is defined in terms of particular events, and the truth conditions are counterfactual and must be spelled out in terms of possible worlds. Whereas if you use variables and functions and different types of functions, you can spell out the truth conditions in the same way as you get truth conditions for laws of nature. So you can experimentally evaluate them by experiment and observation. No need to have knowledge of possible worlds. So how do you evaluate these causal claims? By experiment. Get back to Sophie the pigeon. So if the claim is that perceiving triangles painted in warm colors make the pigeon peck, you can refute this experimentally if you represent warm color with this variable. 0 means other colors, and 1 means red, somewhere in the spectrum of red and yellow. You show that there's no functional dependence because red or yellow sometimes leads to pecking if it's red and sometimes to not pecking if it's yellow. So you can refute it experimentally. And so you show that this is not a sufficient condition, and in the functional dependence model, it means there's no function. And you can refute experimentally that scarlet is not the best variable to choose because the function is not injective. If you have scarlet C equal 1 and C equals 2 other shades of red, you get a function, but it's not injective. So that's a very formal, very simple criterion to explain why scarlet as a variable that causes pecking, it's okay, it's a cause, but it's not a specific cause. So it's not the best to mention in an explanation. Okay, so that I could stop here, but if I have time, I have another part which is a little bit independent. And this is about a consequence of this analysis of causation. And it's a controversial consequence, so that's why I think it's worth telling you about this. It has the obvious implication that causal influence comes in degrees. So if you have a variable y that is influenced by 2 factors, x1 and x2, these factors are more or less strongly influencing y in a mathematical sense, in the sense that one of the linearity factors, a and b, can be greater than the other. And if a is greater than b, then intuitively x1 has a stronger influence on y than x2. I give you a simple example. A and B put poison in X's food. In causation, you always talk about killing and murder because that makes you get clear intuitions. So A and B put poison in X's food, and so they somehow cooperate. One puts 90% of the lethal dose, and the other puts 10% of the lethal dose. So in all, the poor X gets 100% and dies. So if you go to court, you could catch them both and you establish what happened. The judge would probably judge that both are somehow culprits, but one is more a cause than the other. One is did more to bring about X's death than the other. And the degree of their contribution to X's death is proportional to the percentage, I would suggest, the percentage of that they contributed to a sufficient condition. So if you put 100%, you are full responsible. If you put 90%, you are 90% responsible, because it's 90% of a sufficient condition for the result. And I think they are used like that in moral and legal cases. Like if you have, unfortunately, it happens very often that, say, you have chemical plants that put their sewage in a river. And so then downstream you get a disaster. Either all the fish die or the people get ill. It always happens, unfortunately. So who has to pay, or who is to be blamed or punished? The firm that put 90% of the pollutants has to be punished more than the firm that put 10%. I think that's very plausible. And so the challenge is that Carolina Sartorio, I don't know if she's listening, she says that that's not true, and that there are no degrees of causal contribution. So why would you want to say that that's not true, although I have tried to convince you that it's very plausible? So the reason is this. There are two ways in which something can be more of a cause of something than a second factor. X1 can be more of a cause of Y, or make a stronger causal contribution to Y than another factor, X2, if X1 comes closer to being a sufficient condition. But there's another way in which X1 can be more of a cause. X1 can come closer to being a necessary condition. So I give you, these are my examples. Carolina Sartorio has other examples, but I find these simple. So compare two situations. In the first situation, both of A and B put 100% of the lethal dose, so it's overdetermination. So each is a complete cause and has maximal degree of causal contribution. In the second situation, A puts 100% of the lethal dose and B does nothing. So in a sense, it's certainly true that that you can say that A is more of a cause of X's death in the second than in the first situation, because X's death depends more on A in the second than in the first. In the second, it all depends on A. If A doesn't do it, nothing happens. In the first, it depends less on A, because even if A doesn't do anything, X would still die because of the act of B. So, okay, there is a difference in dependence. And the argument is that the strength of causal contribution is the measure of moral and legal responsibility. Okay, but if it is, then degrees of contribution must be comparable. There must be some basis for comparing them to judge who has to pay or who has to go to jail. But there is no common measure for comparing something that comes close to a sufficient condition and something else that comes close to a necessary condition. So because you can't compare them, but you would have to compare them if they existed. Sartorio says they don't exist, so there are no degrees of causal contribution. Okay, so that's another puzzle, and I think, okay, you can reason like that, but I would prefer a solution which accepts this situation while still respecting the intuition that moral and legal judgments are based on degrees of contribution, and then that you can be more or less responsible and more or less blamable for something you did. So the alternative solution I would suggest is that a degree of causal contribution should be measured only in terms of proportion of sufficient condition. So in these two situations, 1 and 2, it's not correct to say that A is more of a cause of X's death when he acts alone than when both act. It's just that it depends more, the result depends more on A's act in the second situation, but that's a difference in non-causal dependence. So why would I say that? Whether X's death depends on A's poisoning, yes or no. If in both situations A puts in 100% of the lethal dose, so why can there be a difference? The difference is extrinsic to the relation between A and X, but causal influence is intrinsic. So the causal influence from A to X is intrinsic to the relation of A to X, must be independent of what happens everywhere else in the universe. So X's death depends more on A's act in the second situation than in the first, but that's a non-causal difference. It's a difference in non-causal dependence. And so moral and legal responsibility has two independent grounds. It's grounded both on causal dependence, so the judge will try to find out who did it in terms of cause, but the judge can also be sensitive to non-causal dependence relations, such as the existence of backup causes, but that's not the same thing. So non-causal and causal dependence relations are independent, and it's not in general possible to weigh them against each other. So it's almost over. So you could react to that by saying, I deny that causal influence must be intrinsic. Okay, so what do I say? I say there is no knockdown argument. I would say that which analysis the most appropriate is a matter of overall judgment. And I think it's obvious that Sartorio's conclusion is wrong. It's just like in the mental exclusion puzzle. It's obvious that it's wrong, that there are no psychological and economical and chemical causes. So here I take it that it's obvious that it's wrong that there are no degrees of causal contribution, because this is it's implicit in our practice of moral and legal judgment all the time. So we should try as far as possible to save this. And I have found another way to escape the conclusion while still preserving this fact. So that's a reason to prefer it to Sartorio's conclusion, which is revisionary, which says it's all an illusion and there are no degrees of causal contribution. So the conclusion of all this is that in the first part I've tried to show that the conclusion of the exclusion argument, which says the mind never changes anything to the world, can be avoided by making a distinction between causation in general and a more specific form of causation. And closure is plausible for causation, and exclusion is plausible for specific causation, in the sense that if you have an explanation in terms of a variable that makes the dependence expressed by an injective function that corresponds to specific causation, that excludes other explanations in terms of non-specific influence, in the sense that it's more appropriate. But in terms of causation, though that's specific causation, but in terms of causation, two different influences do not exclude each other. So this all is just an attempt to reframe the original solution to the problem in the framework of structural equations, and you replace causal sufficiency by causation, proportional causation by specific causation. And I think the main advantage of all this is that you can show that the truth conditions of all these claims are accessible to experiment, no need for possible worlds and counterfactuals and all that. And the last part was to show how you can avoid the denial of the consequence that causal influence comes in degrees by distinguishing between causal and non-causal dependence. Thank you.